Hello! Welcome to part 7 of the Fire Emblem Sync Marathon. This part, we'll be looking at how each title handles its early game, using these chapters as reference from each mainline title. Some highlights will be Genealogy, where Azel promotes in time to sweep the Cross Knights, Conquest, where our bewitching new powerhouse helps us defend Dia Port, and Engage, where, once again, Alfred is awesome as we defend Rhodia Castle. On top of these peak maps, we have some interesting ones, with Binding Blade's ridiculous Chapter 7, an extensive introduction to Sacred Stone's second protagonist, and Revelation's very snowy Chapter 10. While most games don't explicitly convey a breakdown into an early, mid, and late game, I think it's interesting to observe how various aspects like available resources and the story lead to a distinct change in game feel for its first handful of chapters. Rather than trying to determine which is the best or most challenging, I'd just like to discuss a few points about how each title creates an early game experience. What gameplay and narrative elements tie the first chapters together, how engaging or encouraging are they, and what marks the transition into the mid-game. With this in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. With Aurelis Castle reclaimed, Marth now journeys to Arcanea, taking him through the Lufcandi Mountain Pass. Here he encounters the Draco Knight and Princess of Macedon, Minerva, who begrudgingly says she will defend the castle for the sake of her sister. By looking around, we also get a glimpse at the Pegasus Knight trio Paula, Katua, and Est, who I believe are Minerva's guard. The three don't seem threatening individually, but fighting all three on top of the powerful Minerva sounds like quite the difficult task. Of course, since the flyers have character portraits, I figured they must be recruitable, and I was very confident that the house alludes to interacting with Minerva in some way. And so, after defeating the archers in the Little Mountain alcove, I immediately warped Marth to visit the village. I expected, Minerva's sister to show up, who we could then use to talk Minerva down or even recruit her, but no, we are instead rewarded with the Manakete Bantu, whose power lies beyond comprehension. No, but really, I cannot comprehend his combat potential, because while his displayed base stats are really low, I know he gets an impactful stat boost from the Firestone. The game doesn't convey what this boost is, but I get the impression it lets Bantu be decently bulky and get one strong hit off, though locking him to one range. This honestly doesn't seem to live up to Bantu's infamy as a unit, and though he clearly is not Minerva's sister, I figured he would still be useful in holding off her flyers. They reached Marth by turn 2, hovering behind the mountains, so I couldn't just defeat them on player phase before they could hit us. I won't lie, this had me really nervous, and I just had to hope that Marth would dodge enough attacks to survive. And so I was very relieved to see that Minerva refuses to fight and orders the Pegasus trio to retreat alongside her. This leaves just one generic Draco Knight and two Pegasus Knights, which my army was more than equipped to handle turn 3. But with Minerva's group being the main threat of the map, and Minerva's group retreating, that meant there was basically nothing left to do. Just a couple knights at the end, and one long walk from Marth to get from the village to the Seas Point. This is probably the most anticlimactic map of Shadow Dragon, if not the whole marathon so far. I'm sure there will be more exciting maps in the future, but I think this chapter speaks to FE1's relatively chill early game. The first few maps were pretty much just fighting slow, frail, and accurate pirates, which seemed to be meant to give the player a safe space to get used to basic combat, so long as they don't take on too many enemies at once. You can really do anything here, but it seems that if you want Marth to hold forward every turn, then sweeping them all with Ogma or a Cavalier is an effective solution. I will say that chapters 4 through 6 had some tricky moments, with Knights and Cavaliers becoming the prominent enemy types, on top of some tight side objectives. Getting the village in Chapter 4 and the northeastern chest in Chapter 6 required me to instigate several enemies at once, and, while unnecessary, my rush to recruit Bantu this chapter led to a similar situation. In these moments, I couldn't just have Ogma or Kain defeat everything on their own, and I felt encouraged to plan out several player phase kills, with Merrick and the Armor Slayer being necessary for Knights. I haven't noticed a big shift in gameplay just yet, but I would say that at least narratively we've moved past the early game, with the Fire Emblem officially in Marth's hands. I suspect that we might shift to a state where one strong unit can handle most of the combat on their own, especially if a certain strong Draco Knight joins our army, but we'll just have to see. One aspect I don't expect to change is the bulky general bosses guarding Seas Points. I have noticed that Merrick with Excalibur can be a great answer, but he can't reach in time if Marth is holding forward every turn, and Ogma or a Cavalier with the Armor Slayer is the next best option. I got incredibly lucky in Ogma landing his attacks with a crit to boot, so Marth was able to seize right away. Minerva may not join us yet, but I feel satisfied with the strong dragon unit we did recruit. let's just hope next chapter actually has enemies for him to fight. Gaiden. Before continuing her journey north towards Sophia Castle, Celica explores the Seabound Shrine. The first encounter is pretty standard, with mostly low-level revenants and only a couple bone walkers. I'll admit this battle was tougher than I was expecting, but not by much. I kept everyone in a line so the revenants couldn't team up on anyone, and I utilized range attacks from my mages and Leo to keep the situation under control. There's not much XP to be gained, but I tried to get as much for Saber and Leo as I could. There are only a couple more battles before the end of Act 2, and I'd like the two to reach level 7 for a promotion before Act 3. Moving further into the dungeon, I gave all 3 HP fountains to Celica, giving her some more breathing room as a magical frontliner. This immediately came into play as we encounter another group of monsters, this time featuring gargoyles. Their high movement limits the effectiveness of my defensive line formation, and their high speed makes them offensively threatening alongside the many bone walkers. I never expect dungeon encounters to be tough, but this one actually had me sweating a bit. I once again grouped everyone up to stay safe, this time in more of a cluster, so I could keep frail units like Leo and Mei out of enemy range entirely. The gargoyles were my first target, as the biggest threats, but even with them gone, I had to rush to clear out the bone walkers within the next few turns, before all my units got too weakened to hold that defensive formation. After the encounter, we finally reach Seabound Shrine's depths, where we acquire the Blessed Sword. Like the Blessed Ring, this gives passive healing each turn, in addition to monster effectivity. Our next several battles don't have any monsters, but passive healing and a slight boost to physical attacks is a perfect match for Celica. We head back to our ship, and one last time, Celica sets sail north. The 4th pirate raid is very similar to previous battles, with a mix of enemy brigands, mercenaries, and archers, though this time the distribution is a little more even. It lined up for Celica to lead the choke point at first, but I switched to Saber turn 2 to give him more kill opportunities. As usual, my range attackers helped get kills from behind, but a frustrating amount of misses meant it took a few turns to actually break through the choke points. Once I did though, there were just the mercenaries and archer left, which didn't take long to defeat. While this map feels a little repetitive, I will say that I like the idea of Act 2 having a noticeable theme for its early game map design, especially since the boat maps align with what's going on in the narrative. More obviously, Gaiden's act structure gives a clear cutoff point for its game segments, on top of visually showing your destination and progression of the act on the overworld. So I feel very strongly in saying that Gaiden provides a distinct and satisfying early game experience. And what's even cooler is that we get this clear early game experience that eases the player into Gaiden's gameplay for 2 separate routes, with each experience being noticeably different. Alms Act 1 has the player fighting a lot of soldiers and cavaliers in open terrain, which aren't very strong, but make you consider how to position your collective army so no one gets overwhelmed. There's also the mini training arc to get the villagers promoted by Thief Shrine, which teaches the player about teaming up for kills, though you do get the bolt sword that can one-round most everything soon after. Meanwhile, Celica's Act 2 all but forces choke points for most of its maps, encouraging the player to utilize range attacks and get familiar with the new magic system. This is technically our last pirate raid, but we still have one more boat map to wrap up Act 2, as a group of Arcanists ambush Celica's army. We've seen one in Act 1, but now we have to fight several of these decently bulky, ranged magical attackers at once. With 2 choke points, we can try to split them up, so I send Leo and Bowie west, while Celica and Saber once again tag in and out to hold a choke point in the east. A funny aspect of Arcanists we learn here is that they have Recover and love to heal their friends, even if it's just for 1 HP. And because Recover costs 1 HP to use, this can result in a massive heal chain. This is effectively pointless, but it does get most of the Arcanists to move together towards the eastern choke point, while Leo and Bowie are only left with a couple to fight. As a result, Leo and Bowie aren't in much danger, but Leo can only get a couple kills. This was concerning because both he and Saber started the map around level 5, and I figured they would each need a lot of kills to reach level 7 for promotion. However, what I learned is that these Arcanists give a crazy amount of experience by Gaiden standards, with over 40 XP per kill. So while this may not be a narratively exciting map to indicate the end of the early game, I really like its role in the gameplay, giving one last push for units to get promoted before the next act. Not only will future map design look different as we fight ashore, but our couple units of choosing should have a noticeable power spike to match the stronger, new types of enemy formations in Act 3. Alm's route may have had it tougher to get units up to promotion, but he at least had the final map that was both exciting narratively and in the gameplay, with the Grand Castle Siege. In the end, I was able to get Saber to level 7, getting several of the Arcanist kills. I tried to have Leo backtrack after getting his couple kills in the west, but he was too late, ending the map with just 18 XP between him and his promotion. However, all is not lost, because in going back to Sidon Shrine, we have to do one more encounter to reach the Milla Idol anyways. A very uneventful couple turns fighting Revenants, and Leo reached level 7. With that, he was all set to promote to Sniper, alongside Saber promoting to Myrmidon. I wouldn't say they were the stars of Act 2 by any means, but it does feel nice to have our efforts culminate in some promotions. The mages will likely have to wait until the end of Act 3 to get their big promotions, but their newly learned spells, like Thunder and Angel, should let them continue to have both strong and fun contributions going forward. On our way to Zovia Castle, we stop by Zovia Harbor, where we get a glimpse at the Pegasus Knight sisters Pella and Katria. Unlike FE1, Est is missing in the sisters' first showing, but all the same, we don't get to recruit any of the White Wings just yet. And so we move on to Zovia Castle, where the people are celebrating some hero who liberated southern Sofia. Mycen directs Celica to the roof, whereupon she discovers that this hero was none other than her childhood friend, The reunion is dashed by heated words, however, and the two split up, resolving to end the war with Rigel their own way. And so our time with just Celica comes to a close, but don't worry, we'll be back with Celica's army very soon. Mystery of the Emblem. Marth's next steps to collect the astral shards lead him to the Fane of Ramen, a temple that has become overrun by thieves. Our mission is to reclaim the temple in the northeast, but we would also like to chase after the thieves running north to recollect the temple's treasure, all while avoiding a group of incredibly strong heroes in the northwest. Upon starting the map, we see the young girl Fina running away from the thieves, guided by the mercenary Nabarro. The two start isolated in the middle of the thieves' forest, setting up a very interesting situation. As a dancer, Fina is very frail, but she can refresh Nabarro, who has really solid combat, to run around and defeat thieves. The main concern being, can you get away with defeating the thieves running north, while also keeping enemies away from Fina? Without knowing the AI of whether or not thieves would prioritize running north or attacking, I perhaps played safer than I needed to, but I still thought this was an engaging but chill challenge by Mystery of the Emblem standards. What's especially nice is that there was no other intense aspect to the map. I had the Pegasus Knights fly around the forest to ensure I could catch all the thieves, with Sheeta taking all the shards in the hope of getting big level ups from several easy thief kills. I suppose I could have tried to have Sirius lead the infantry in a fight against Astrom's group of heroes, but this sounded way out of scope for my army, so I just had them slowly cross the forest alongside Marth for basically no reason. And yeah, that was the chapter. Considering all the crazy challenges the previous chapters gave us, I'm left wondering whether this marks a transition in map design, or if this is more so meant to be like an interlude, providing a ton of treasure on top of a dancer before leading into even more ridiculous chapters. Regardless, I would observe this chapter as the end of the early game from a gameplay perspective, which lines up pretty nicely with last chapter being the end of the first narrative arc in Grust. We've already gotten 2 Knight Crests, one of which I used to promote Luke into Paladin, and this chapter drops the first Hero Crest, Orion's Bolt, and Dragon Whip. For my team, I believe this means I can promote Ogma, Gordon, and one of our Pegasus Knights. I didn't get the opportunity to make these promotions this chapter, but I don't see a reason to not just do so at the start of next chapter, as I don't even think promoted units have slower XP gain. And on top of our new Dancer, and our trainees having gotten several shard stack level ups, I feel confident that upcoming maps should be much less stressful. A welcome change, because wow, were some of these early maps rough. There were a lot of side objectives locked behind a tough challenge, like chasing after thieves in Chapter 2 and 5 to get their item, in which the high move units had to tackle some really strong enemy formations. This sometimes included promoted Draco Knights, during which our units were unpromoted. The only real answer was to have Linda and the archers just barely team up for a kill, which required careful positioning to keep them safe and even just to reach the Draco Knight because of all the restrictive terrain. Because I've played other Fire Emblem games and am doing this for a series, I will admit that all these types of challenges are very unique for an early game, and this could be perceived as cool and fun. However, it was very discouraging and frustrating for me, and it really makes me appreciate how other games ease the player into Fire Emblem's gameplay, rather than immediately providing intense challenges. We actually do have one last twist provided at the end of this chapter, but this one was actually pretty funny. I neglected to visit a certain village until near the end of the map, but once I did, I was warned that I should absolutely not get near the cave in the west. I mean, I wasn't planning to, but when you put it like that, of course I'm going to check out the cave. Thankfully, I put Pala up to the task, because I was jump scared by a threatening fire dragon. I got lucky in dodging their defense-ignoring attacks, and so Pala was able to defeat them over the course of a few turns, collecting their fire stone. I had to stall against some reinforcements at the end, and though I got nervous I had accidentally drawn over Astrum's heroes in the process, they seemed determined to guard their bridge unless you actively attack them. And so I was able to delay an encounter with Astrum for now, but with the Fane of Ramen successfully seized, an encounter with Astrum seems inevitable, as Marth next sets his sights on claiming Jasmine Bridge for himself. Genealogy of the Holy War. Sigurd now has the southern half of Augustria under his control, but he attempts to keep peace with the northern territories, letting the King Jagal escape. However, before Sigurd can relent control willingly, Jagal returns with a vengeance to reclaim Augusti himself, while pirates from Orgehill in the far north take advantage of the chaos, and Eldigan watches over the conflict at Silvale in the west. Neither Sigurd nor Eldigan wish to fight, but regardless, everyone takes to arms in a case of self-defense. Well, everyone except Deirdre, who Sigurd commands to stay safe in Augusti, and by self-defense, I of course mean that we will be completing our conquest of Augustria, starting with the nearby Medino. To prepare for this conflict, we turn to the arena to get our first promotions. Now that we've acquired the experience doubling Paragon Band, we can get units from around level 16 to the necessary level 20. There's an upfront cost of 40,000 gold for each unit to trade this ring, but you basically make it all back from clearing the arena and selling the ring back to the pawnbroker. I've gotten many of our units to afford this upfront cost, and by getting just a bit lucky, Azel clears the entire arena with the Paragon Band, reaching level 20 and unlocking his promotion to Mage Knight. Finn also had the Paragon Band for the arena, so he got enough experience to promote to Duke Knight. And because Lex innately has the Paragon skill, he's already reached level 20 for promotion to Great Knight. Lastly, I give the Pursuit Band to Lewin and the Night Band to Sylvia, and we're off to crush Medino Castle. There's a lot going on in this map, and to tackle it all at once, I split my units into several groups. With this new promotion, Azel is now the leading force in the main group, taking on the Bow Knight and Armor Knight groups directly guarding Medino. His new mount on top of a dance means he can instigate enemies just as soon as our other cavalry. His 1-2 ranged magical offense is strong enough to one-round most every enemy, and between the shield ring and just generally facing low hit rates, he has competent survivability. Most of the infantry followed Azel, but I sent Lewin to fight the few Armor Knights in the east, while Lex and Quan fought the cavalry approaching from the west, and Aaron fought the forest mages. Lastly, I left the Paragon Band on Lachesis, whose job was to spam the return staff for 60 experience per use, with my filler units like Noish and Medir being stuck in an endless cycle of running from our castle to Lachesis, just to be sent straight back. Genealogy structure makes it difficult for me to pinpoint an early, mid, and late game, but if I had to, I would say Chapter 3 feels like a noticeable shift in gameplay. We've had enough opportunities to establish what units we want to train, giving them a significant boost from level ups, new weapons, rings that give skills, and potentially even a promotion. Chapter 3 even seems well suited to show this off, with several different groups of similar type enemies, ensuring that whoever you've trained has a favorable matchup to show off their acquired strength. Meanwhile, the prologue through Chapter 2 felt much more skewed around having a couple specific units be competent at carrying combat. If you want a unit to kill everything, it basically has to be Sigurd, with Quan and Lex as honorable mentions for their decent physical bulk. But as demonstrated here, the units we chose to train can now be the center of our strategies. And because I chose to train more than just Sigurd, I'm able to quickly defeat all the initial enemy groups by turn 6. With an Astroproc using her new Brave Sword, Ira took out the boss, earning our second magical weapon, the Bolt Sword. Knowing that our next conflict will be at Silvale, I rushed Azel back west with a warp, before seizing with Sigurd the next turn. I certainly feel great in our crushing victory, but sadly for Sigurd, this is where everything starts crumbling down. Chagall is actually hiding in Silvale, guarded by Eldigan and his Cross Knights, and it is revealed that Langbolt's conspiracy against Sigurd has further escalated. The priest Claude and Reptar's daughter Tailtu go to seek answers in the Tower of Bragi in the northwest, but it turns out their help would have been greater appreciated in the south, where Deirdre is ambushed and kidnapped by Mainfroy, leaving her and Sigurd's child, Selith, behind at Anthony. But nonetheless, Sigurd must fight on, with a confrontation with Eldigan inevitable. Eldigan is just as incredibly strong as we saw in Chapter 1, and we really don't want to face an attack from his Mistletoe. Fortunately, I knew you can have Rikestis talk to him, making the main challenge clearing out enough Cross Knights so Rikestis can reach him without anyone ever getting in Eldigan's range. The road tiles made this tricky to count out, but I eventually settled on a formation where Azel could sweep most every Cross Knight. Genealogy's first chapters were no stranger to large blocks of enemies led by a strong boss, but I think this approach feels pretty different by now. To enemy phase them all, you really need some combination of 1-2 range, physical bulk, and a magical weapon, and not a lot of units fit that description at base. If you aren't doing a Sigurd solo run, you kind of have to engage most of your army to handle enemies on an individual basis, rather than just sweeping them en masse. This wasn't too difficult at first, with a lot of slow, inaccurate brigands early on that our many sword units had a strong matchup against, thanks to the new weapon triangle. Now, if we had to deal with enemies on an individual basis, I would be quite worried, with really strong and bulky knights and cavaliers. Thankfully, we don't have to though, since at this point, many units could have been trained, given some stat boosting rings, and a magical weapon to kill everything in sight. Of these options, Azel seems to be pretty good. He got Eldigan down to just 5 Cross Knights that I could easily defeat on player phase, clearing the way for Rikestis to make her move. She convinces Eldigan to lay down his arms, but in an attempt to put a complete stop to the Augustrian conflict, Eldigan returns to Silvale, which does not go well. The attempt costs Eldigan his life, and while he leaves behind the Earth Sword for his sister, he also leaves us with the task of quelling Silvale. As we approach, some Draco Knights appear in the northwest, and I rush to defeat the knights guarding Silvale before they can reach us. These knights were a little trickier to sweep because of their huge offense, but I was able to get enough player face kills with Azel, Sigurd, Lewin, Lex, and Ethlin to safely clear them out. And so, I had time to severely weaken Chagall with Azel before the Draco Knights got in range, letting Azel take the last turn to defeat their boss for their renewal band. Ethlin then defeated Chagall, setting up Sigurd to seize, disabling the remaining Draco Knights and completing his conquest of Augustria. A bitter victory, especially as Sigurd officially hears word of Deirdre's disappearance, but no time to dwell on our losses, as the Tower of Bragi and Orgehill Castle will soon demand our attention in the north. Thracia, 776. As the last stretch in his escape from Munster, Leif must run through a mountain pass to reach Castlemeath and seek aid from Thracia. A begrudging request, considering Leif's past with Thracia, but their General Hannibal is his best option for safety, so to Castlemeath we go. We have 2 paths to choose from, an eastern road where a group of Myrmidon bounty hunters await us, and the western mountain pass filled with bandits. Soon enough, Cavalier reinforcements will pour in from the north, and while blitzing through the Myrmidons would be our quickest route, I opt to trudge through the mountains for the sake of recruiting one of the Myrmidons, Shiva, who we saw with the pirates back in Chapter 2X. This is because we need Safi to talk to him, who shows up in the southwestern corner of Turn 2. Thankfully, she convinces Finn to rejoin Leif's army with her, giving us back our main staff user and an actually strong combat unit. Because I sent everyone through the mountain pass, the Myrmidons now see Finn as the closest enemy, so they'll wrap around to meet him, drawing Shiva right to Safi. Meanwhile, everyone in the northwest took their turn moving a couple tiles at a time through all the terrain. Once again, Asbel was the leading combat unit, using leaf support and avoid terrain to dodge tank these inaccurate axe users. The warrior and berserker are actually pretty strong, but nothing that a crit or 2 can't handle. Even with Asbel clearing a path, it took a few turns to get all my cavalry and infantry across the first mountain, and I just barely made it before the reinforcements caught up. Because they themselves are cavaliers and enemies don't dismount, they can't pursue us, and will instead have to go all the way back through the road to catch us at the escape points. While Leif will continue fighting an uphill battle throughout the rest of the game, completing this chapter marks an important narrative shift. Instead of being directly on the run, Leif can start fighting back against the Empire, and with this brings some important changes in the gameplay. We just got our mounts back, we've had the opportunity for scroll stacked level ups, and if I weren't greedy for XP, we could use the Master Seals we just got for big promotions. Next chapter we'll gain access to a convoy and prep screen, which is really nice considering the focus on item management with capturing. Also, while our entire army has had to push through the past several chapters to survive, Leaf's final escape gives us some breathing room. As such, the fatigue mechanic can be introduced, forcing us to rotate units in and out of map deployments. I would say preps and fatigue are pretty huge for Thracia, and their exclusion from the first grouping of chapters really helps solidify their place as a distinct early game. Normally I would say holding off on introducing engaging features makes for a boring first impression, but I think it's fair enough. It connects well with the narrative, as after the first couple maps, Leaf's army is on the run and has no time to collect themselves or rest. Also, Thracia is already giving the player a lot to figure out, with capture, rescue drop, and a lot of other niche mechanics on top of basic combat. And with plenty of challenging moments going on, I'm certainly not left bored. The first few maps felt pretty chill, with weak soldiers and pirates that everyone matches up well against, and if you really want, you can just have Avil, Dagdar, and Finn completely dominate. Starting Chapter 4 though, you actually have to scrape together kills with underleveled units, with several being locked to swords and doors, while a lot of enemies have 2 range options, like javelins, tomes, and bows. I really like that the player doesn't have a get out of jail free card during this time, because I think teaming up for kills and training low-level units is fun. The risky exception is Asbel, who can actually enemy phase large groups if you give him everything and bank on some dodges. I don't have Asbel sweep all the Cavalier reinforcements at the end, but he does hold off a few as the rest of our army crosses the final mountains before the escape points, now including Shiva. I like him well enough, and I'll make a half-hearted attempt to train him going forward. There's not really much left for him to do this map though, as once we start our escape, General Hannibal sends out his knights to chase off our pursuers for good. If I knew about this ahead of time, I could have rushed one unit to the escape point to trigger the event earlier and avoid fighting the reinforcements entirely. But hey, I've had Leaf's army escaping on the final turn together all this time, so it's only right they conclude this arc the same way. Now, let's wish poor Asbel a good rest after all the fatiguing experiences I've put him through. Binding Blade. With rebellion breaking out in Ostia, Roy makes his final push towards Ostia Castle, challenging the rebels in the town outside before making his way inside to save Lelina. We have to quickly push past a horde of knights, soldiers, mercenaries, and cavaliers, so that we can visit the villages and move north before getting overrun by cavalier reinforcements in the south. Dealing with all these enemies at once is challenging enough, but we also have 3 Wyvern Riders that will swoop in from the north if we get too close, who are incredibly bulky and strong. To make matters worse, the Paladin Jarrett and the Cavalier Trek show up near the villages as allies, who don't know any better and will fight to their death if we don't recruit them right away. While I've been very frugal with using Jagan-like characters, this chapter left me with all but no choice but to rely on Marcus to do as much as possible. Even then, it was quite ridiculous, and I could come up with no consistent strategy to get through the first several turns. So I decided to just lean into strategies that I knew were unreliable but at least would be successful, even if it meant resetting over and over and over. Probably the most consistent part was having Roy dodge one of 2 attacks turn 1 after getting rescue dropped forward, so that he was in range to recruit Jarrett turn 2, who could then recruit Trek, who could then rescue Roy to safety in the back lines. I don't care for either of their characters, but at the very least, Jarrett basically gives us a second copy of Marcus to help us get by in this chapter, and Trek, well, I'll take any amount of chip damage I can get to handle this giant cluster of enemies. Turn 3, yet another Cavalier shows up in Noah, though his arena partner Fear heads towards the Western Isles. I have a deep personal grudge against Noah, so I will absolutely not be using him long term either, but like Trek, every bit of chip damage counts here. With the full Cavalier squad recruited and the assorted infantry enemies barely under control, we can now turn our attention to the Wyvern Knights. The Eastern and Western Wyverns specifically start moving once they can reach a unit within 2 turns, meaning I ended up immediately provoking one in the rush to recruit Jarrett. With so many other generic enemies to kill on player phase, I didn't have the action economy to have everyone team up on it, but I had to stand my ground. Fortunately, we have a super trained Wolt on their side with the Roy support, so Marcus could deal with the first third of the Wyvern's health, and Wolt could finish the rest all on his own. I was still left in a very scary situation, but at least with the first Wyvern gone, I had just enough breathing room to keep my weakened unit safe, while clearing out the rest of the town. While I've complained about every Binding Blade map so far, this one was by far the most frustrating, but this time for sure, I think the game gets better from here. Most of the challenges seem defined by the limitation of opportunities to influence your army, which has to face up against some really tough enemies. In fact, I learned that the first 5 chapters gave enemies twice as much of a boost for hard mode than the rest of the game, and during that time, we were mostly stuck with units at base level, basic weapons from starting inventories, limited sources of healing, and no prep screen. Chapter 6 served as a nice shift, with enemies being not quite so strong, and being able to plan out a strong opening turn with the prep screen. But I'd like to say that this, or maybe next chapter, marks the end of Binding Blade's early game. We start getting promotion items, and we get some strong weapons like the Horse Slayer and Killing Edge, so we can now choose some non-pre-promotes to actually match up well against enemies. Surpassing this chapter also feels like a cool rite of passage, and saving Lilina next chapter will wrap up the narrative's first arc. Don't get me wrong, this may make for a distinguished early game, and I believe normal mode is chill enough to be a nice introduction to Fire Emblem gameplay, but I think hard mode is too much. Between 2 strong enemies, low hit weapons, and a limited army, it feels like you need to string together and land several inaccurate attacks without much room for backup plans. The one strong matchup we had was Deke and Rutger against fighters and knights with the Armor Slayer, and anyone against the soldiers. But those Cavaliers, Mercenaries, and Wyvern Knights were something else. In the end, I was able to visit the villages and group up everyone north with a couple turns to spare before the Cavalier reinforcements stormed in. The boss group took mercy on me, with only soldiers, mages, and archers to handle, while I had just about my whole army around. I only had a few Armor Slayer uses left for the night boss, but those few uses were enough to have Deke and Alan team up for the kill. Wolt took a moment at the end to brag to Roy about all the wyverns he shot down, unlocking their B support just before Roy seized. I am so relieved to put this chapter behind me, and hopefully move on to some less stressful gameplay as we save Lilina. Blazing Blade. With Lyn safe, Hector moves to reclaim Castle Caelin, which is still occupied by lost soldiers. Some Caelin soldiers have been imprisoned, including the adorable mercenary Raven and his boyfriend Lucius. On top of recruiting these two and saving the soldiers, there are also some chests threatened by thieves in the northwest that encourage us to rush north through the castle's halls. I think to save both chests, you basically need Marcus to sprint forward on his own, but the time pressure wasn't made clear from the start of the map, so I just went with my typical approach of moving as fast as I could, while also setting up kills for my units of choosing. This now includes Lyn and Florina, who I'd also like to have wait next to each other each turn to maximize support points. Turn 1, I'm able to defeat the Mercenary, Knight, and Myrmidon, ending in a position that kept my frail units safe from the archers. We then see Raven break out of his cell, intent to get revenge on Hector. While Matthew goes on a side mission to open chests in the west, everyone else takes a few turns to wind their way through the castle's halls. I'm once again able to get most of the important kills on player phase, ending with my bulky units in front to keep everyone else safe from the remaining few enemies. And so when Raven approaches, I'm all clear to have his sister Priscilla recruit him, springing a new set of events. The allied soldiers break out of their cell, so we can go recruit Lucius, but the soldiers are a little too eager and seek out enemies. I didn't realize just how weak they were until they started getting close to Cavalier reinforcements from the south, so while Raven, Florina, and the Lord Trio moved north towards the throne, I had to leave Lowen, Oswin, and Sane behind to keep the soldiers out of trouble. This was a little frustrating, but like most of Blazing Blade's early chapters, the difficulty didn't feel ridiculous by any means. The first few chapters on Hector hard mode felt a little reliant on good RNG when holding Marcus back, but even then they still felt reasonable, unlike Binding Blade, which was bad even with Marcus in play. Weapons have more hits, you have Hector and Oswin for big offense and defense, enemy quality is low, and you get the prep screen after just a few chapters. I'll say that just beating the maps might be a little too boring, especially if you let Marcus loose, but splitting up and playing aggressively to accomplish side objectives, like the Southern Village in Chapter 14 and the chests and boss kill in Chapter 15, kept things engaging for me. I'll also mention that Hector hard mode specifically has some interesting enemy compositions, with Pegasus Knights that threaten to fly past your bulky units and hit frail units like Matthew, Sarah, and Urk. I mean, I don't think it always plays out like this, since you can just leave Hector and Oswin in range to destroy them, but I appreciate the attempt to keep the player on guard. The one enemy type I could go without, however, is the starting position Ambush Cavaliers, which once again got the jump on Merlinus. Like previous chapters, I didn't know to leave anyone behind, so Merlinus had to make another retreat. As for the north, I just assumed I would need everyone around for the boss, so I just had Hector wait until the southern units could catch up. I eventually realized though that Hector actually does really well with the Wolf Bale, so he was able to take the kill on his own and seize. After we reclaim Kaelin's throne and ensure everyone is safe and sound, Hector's spy Layla informs us of the Black Fang's activity behind the ongoing conflict across Lycia, and advises we go to the Dragon's Gate on the Dread Isle of Valor. This apparently involves a dangerous journey across the sea, and, long story short, Hector ends up fighting a group of pirates led by Fargus to earn a place on their ship. The goal is simply to talk to Fargus by the docks, but there are a lot of enemies in the way, and only a few deployment slots. With so many pirates, I load up on sword users. Raven in particular seemed well suited to clear out the enemies, so I figured this would be a good opportunity to get him going as a dominant force in my army. We get a little tip from GBA Anna on how to safely get to Fargus, which I interpreted as sneak around the side passages rather than barreling through the cluster of enemies in the center. However, it turns out I was specifically supposed to move through the north, and by rushing Hector to a choke point to handle the southern pirates, I immediately triggered every enemy to start moving. On top of this, the Paladin Damien ambushes us from the south turn 2 with his own set of enemies, leading to this lovely setup turn 3 of Hector against the world. Now, my Hector is actually really bulky, and the enemies were content to sit at the choke point as I took them out one by one. My main concern though was the mages, as if they got an opportunity to get in range of Hector, I feared he would not be able to kill them before the mages could kill him. And so after Lynn finished defeating some pirates in the northern passage, I had her and Raven draw over enemies from the horde one or two at a time, thinning their numbers without getting in range of too many at once. This was a very long and tense process, but slowly but surely, I was able to clear this massive group. As Hector prepares to set sail for the Dragon's Gate, I think it's fair to say that Blazing Blade's early game has structurally come to an end. Well, if you count Lynn's mode, then it's already been over, and I do think it's interesting to see tutorial maps locked to a game mode you can skip on future playthroughs. For the sake of our discussion though, I'm willing to discuss Hector mode as its own game. Like Binding Blade, we had a big outdoor map leading to a castle map, wherein we completed the first main narrative goal of saving an ally. We also just got our first promotion items, so we could promote Lowen and soon enough Raven. However, I'm confident we can get away without an early promotion, and while saving Lynn was cool, I feel like we're still just continuing our mysterious, vague quest to take down the Black Fang. As such, I don't think there's actually going to be a huge shift in game feel and practice, but I can at least see the vision. There is one more event before we take off though, and that's recruiting the shaman Kanos from a village. I would have recruited him earlier in the map to help fight the pirates if I knew he was there, but I did not, so his training arc will have to wait. Getting to use Dark Tomes is pretty cool, so while I don't think any of his individual stats are particularly impressive, he'll still be joining the team alongside Raven. I was cautious when it came time to approach Fargus, worried that he might just run up and kill one of our units. Thankfully he doesn't move, so I was able to just move Hector forward, wait, and safely talk to Fargus. Hector then makes peace with the pirates, so we can put Burn behind us and sail the seas towards our future. Sacred Stones. We switch perspectives to that of Erica's brother, Ephraim, who has been fighting against Grotto to assist Erica while avoiding capture. His next exploits take him to Renville Castle, which sounds like a lot to take on with just a small army of cavaliers, but Ephraim assures us that he doesn't pick fights he can't win, and so we press on to the castle. The map is indeed a lot for our army of 4, but it serves as a chill and rather lengthy introduction to our second protagonist. Quite interestingly, Ephraim's Lord class wields lances, and his personal weapon, Regenleaf, is like a really strong rapier. Like most lords, he's not the bulkiest, but he can live a couple hits, and his offense is actually impressive. Kyle and Ford are cavaliers, with Kyle being a bit stronger and bulkier, while Ford is a little faster. Lastly, Orson is our strong paladin that can kill everything. And if you know anything about me, it shouldn't be a surprise that I'll be avoiding using Orson while giving as many kills as I can to Ephraim. The first formation is actually kind of interesting without using Orson for combat, with a few enemies that all our units can take on at once to immediately get into the chest room. From there, we have to secure the chest while finding a mage, and ideally set up a rescue chain to jump Ephraim back to the front lines on the path to the throne. Once we're on that path though, it's really just a matter of drawing enemies over a few at a time, using Ford to set up the kills for Ephraim and Kyle, healing with vulneraries, and repeats. To follow up on my analysis of the series' protagonists, I think Ephraim is pretty good. I'd say he's compelling in that I'm rooting for him in his fight against Grotto, and he's given a strong relationship with his sister and another main character we'll see later on. I don't think his blunt demeanor is the easiest to personally connect with though. His unit is unique as a lord with only lances at base, which yes means he can juggernaut with javelins, but he also just generally has flexibility for player phase kills, and he can wield stronger weapons that further boost his role as a heavy hitter. I don't actually think being an infantry unit with strong combat plays a super interesting role in the gameplay though, especially when maps are as linear as this one. But nonetheless, a siege unit actually getting to frontline and destroy enemies with an effective lance gives me a rush that I can't really explain. I also really like his design and battle sprites, so overall I'm a big Ephraim fan, but at the same time I can totally understand if others don't feel the same. Sadly for me, we won't be sticking with Ephraim after this chapter, but I'll spoil that in a few chapters we'll get a chance to choose either Erica or Ephraim as the main lord, with each having their own route for the mid-game. Much like the early game conclusions for the other GBA games, this route split will happen after a windy castle map where we save an allied lord and finish gathering the first set of promotion items. Like Blazing Blade, I don't plan to insta-promote anyone, and while I know many people would advise to do so, I like that the route split and narrative conclusion ensures that the player feels a clear conclusion to the game's first arc, even if you choose to delay promotions. As for early game difficulty, well, Sacred Stones is in a similar position as Blazing Blade, as you can just have the strong paladin kill the many low-quality enemies, but everyone else can still reasonably team up for kills if you want to use them. Enemy composition was almost entirely fighters, soldiers, and weak monsters, and we've only just now gotten into generic knights and cavaliers, which by no means require effective weaponry like in Binding Blade. I think it works well to ease the player into the game with enemies that anyone can do well against, but perhaps there could have been more side objectives that rewarded the player for splitting up their army and or pushing their pace. Chapter 5 did a good job with its many villages and Joshua recruitment, and I know next chapter can be tough, but otherwise I'm not very inspired, even without having Seth kill everything. Case in point, after 20 turns of walking through the hallways and killing enemies with Ephraim and Kyle, we finally make it to the throne. Ephraim shows off his great damage output, doubling the boss for big damage, and though it takes a couple turns to land enough attacks, Ephraim gets the kill, showing off his adorable battle sprites in the process. After, he finally gets to seize, and while the General Walter catches up with him, Ephraim resolves to overcome his forces. We're left on a cliffhanger as to his fate, but don't worry, we'll be back with Ephraim soon enough. Path of Radiance. Ike heads to the port town of Toha to secure a ship to Benyon. The residents aren't the most hospitable, and seem rather complacent about the war breaking out, but regardless, we settle down for a moment to complete our preparations. Here we can check in with the prisoners we freed last chapter, of which I'll be using Nephany and Kieran. I'm mostly using Kieran because I love his heroic and oh-ho attitude, but he also happens to be pretty strong as an ex-cavalier. I'm not so sure what to expect from Nephany as a soldier, and I won't be going all out for a Vantage Sweep build using her innate Wrath skill, but she should be able to get kills just fine. My main focus is Kieran, and I even forged an axe with extra hits and crits to synergize with his innate Gamble command. We then set out for the docks, but before we can get far, Daean soldiers in pursuit of Valentia quickly appear and lock down the town. A boat awaits us at the docks, but as we try to sneak our way through the town, Ike gets caught up with a skirmish that attracts Daean soldiers, and we now have to fight our way to the docks, with a few villages to visit along the way, and a group of weak vigilantes that we get bonus experience for sparing. Some thieves threaten the villages, and among the vigilantes is the Myrmidon Zehark, who we can recruit with either of our Laguz units. I send Leth north with Oscar to recruit Zehark, and Mordecai sticks in the south to smite a vigilante back so Marcia can do a hit and run on the southern village. I also leave Boyd behind to one-round all the soldiers pursuing us, and everyone else charges northwest to the port. There's a village we need to save by turn 2, and while Titania can immediately block it off, This results in several enemies blocking the path forward. However, to get the max turn count bonus experience and avoid the vigilantes tailing Mordecai from the south, I want to keep pushing north. I had to hold the choke point turn 2 with Titania and Kieran, but by turn 3, all my infantry units were around, ready to get the remaining kills on player phase, so that Titania could charge forward and get in range of the boss. Meanwhile, Leth, Oscar, and Boyd continued their path north, fighting through a couple generic enemies and waiting for a moment to approach Zehark without getting in range of the vigilantes. And all the while, I kept an eye out on the inconspicuous closed village in the center of the map. Narratively, this chapter lines up well with the other games, with Ike setting out for his main quest of escorting Valentia, even going via boat like Blazing Blade. However, I would put the end of the early game back at Chapter 8, where Ike steps up as the leader of the Grail mercenaries and begins both his involvement in the war and his conflict with the Black Knights. This also lines up with the base being unlocked, which seems to make a pretty big shift in the gameplay, expanding on the pre-battle options of previous prep screens. The Forge and bonus experience lets the player give any other units a huge power spike, even more so than an early promotion item. In fact, you can give these boosts on top of a promotion, which you don't even need an item for if you get up to level 21, which bonus experience is helping you reach. Ironically enough, I'd speculate this doesn't actually change feature gameplay too drastically, as even in the early game, the player has a really strong unit in Titania that can one-round most everything on her own. It's just that now we can choose any unit to fill this role. If anything, the existence of bonus experience seems to change how the early game is played, as you can have Titania kill everything, knowing other units like Boyd and Soren can catch up later. Or you can do what I did and never have a super unit kill everything, and continue to train up several units equally. Either way, I think the team flexibility opened up by Path of Radiance's base is the main change, and not actually the ability to have a really strong unit. I was able to safely recruit Zehark and keep the Vigilantes safe by rescuing Leth away with Oscar, but the Eastern group still had pressure as the Black Knight appears from the closed village. They would completely destroy anyone they attack, but Oscar and Zehark were able to hide in the northeast corner just long enough to stay out of range before Ike arrived in the northwest. The Wyvern Lord Har also showed up to threaten our starting positions alongside the Draco Knight Jill, but we were long gone and securing the arrive points. I tried going for a funny gamble crit with Kieran for the final kill, doubling his crit in exchange for having his hit. I mean, I did not get the crit, but we have plenty of journey left to win the gamble. Radiant Dawn. Part 2 of Countries and Kings. Dayan has been reborn, and word of Peleus's coronation soon reaches Crimea. The new queen, Valencia, wishes to keep peace with Dayan, but the Crimean nobles question her authority, and unrest settles across the nation. Her allies Joffrey and Lucia are also called into question by the nobles at a meeting, and Marcia comes by to cheer up Valencia. While the two are flying back to the castle though, they spot a group of Vanyan wyverns attempting to capture the Heron princess, Leanne. She's guarded by the raven Genealogy, but Legu's gauge only lasts so long, so Valencia and Marcia join the mid-air flight against Benyon. The goal is to survive for 8 turns, but the enemies will try to capture Leanne, and we lose if they leave the map with her. Part 2's cast is going to switch around a lot, but for now our lord is Valencia, who isn't overwhelmingly strong with swords in her personal queen class, but she can dodge tank these wyverns pretty well while 2-rounding them, and also has staves. Marcia doesn't fare quite so well as a Falcon Knight with lances, and like Path of Radiance, I don't care much for her, but we will still use her in moments of need such as this. Genealogy then has similar one-range combat as Valencia and starts this map transformed, but this means he can only help us for the first few turns. Lastly, Leanne's Heron class has a 2-way refresh, specifically targeting the adjacent units north and south of her, or east and west. A nice aspect of all these units is that they can fly, but as all the enemies in this map also fly, we're actually on even footing. The shifting cloud terrain keeps the map layout interesting, as we can use it to keep enemies from reaching Leanne. However, I want to do more than just survive, and defeat the boss to get his short axe. With only 4 units that make for 5 decently strong player phase attacks though, I end up taking several turns to thin out the generic wyverns first. Some were able to capture Leanne a few times during this process, and while this cut into my available player phase actions, it meant one less wyvern that could attack, and I could just defeat the wyvern before they escaped to free Leanne. Not only is this mid-air battle unique, but Part 2 overall creates a distinct feel from Part 1 by having its units all start in competent Tier 2 classes. There's still tension when fighting other promoted enemies, and Radiant Dawn added Tier 3 classes, so we still have the promise of a power spike after training a unit. It's just that now, there feels like a noticeable gap between the upcoming Dawn Brigade units of Part 1 and the experienced recurring units from Path of Radiance that we are starting to follow. And while the game can still give these Tier 2 units tough matchups, they can also give them some weaker enemies to crush and assert their dominance against, whereas we were always fighting up with the Dawn Brigade. So to generalize, I think that Radiant Dawn marks a clear transition out of its early game, not just from its part structure, but also by switching from small maps with tense combat to larger maps with some easier combat and more challenging objectives. One indicator of this shift in combat is our new Dragon Master, Har, who Marcia convinces to help protect Valentia. He's really strong, bulky, and fast enough to double most enemies, making him a dominant force when available. He's just a little late in this chapter, as I'm already finishing up by turn 5, but he's able to make quick work of the boss, so everyone else can focus on protecting Leanne from the final horde of generic wyverns. From there, all we have to do is press end turn several times, and we successfully drive off Benion's forces. Valentia then gets to talk to Leanne, who hums that she needs to see Ike. Issue being that Ike's been away from Crimea for over a year, so in a twist of fate, Valentia will now be leading an escort party to Ike because of Benion. This will have to wait though, as we switch perspectives yet again, this time to the countryside to see Crimea's unrest firsthand. Here, familiar faces Nephany and Braum encounter Crimean soldiers spurring their village into a rebellion. The two side with Valentia, but in doing so, turn the village against them. So now, our goal is to drive the Crimean soldiers away by defeating their boss, and we'll get bonus experience for sparing the misled village volunteers. I'm not sure how Nephany and Braum hold up throughout the game, but their start in this chapter is quite strong. In fact, it's a little too strong against the volunteers, who are low-leveled Tier 1 enemies that die in one round of combat. Fortunately, most have 2-range options, so we don't have to worry about counterattacking them, but they still end up chasing after us as we deal with the actual enemies. I leave Braum behind to visit the northern village and distract most enemies, while Nephany makes a dash for the southeast after visiting the western village. By shoving her directly above the southern ledge before acting, she's able to shake the northern volunteers off her trail and stay out of range of the one guarding the southwestern village. This also kept her just on time to talk to the rogue Heather, who shows up as a green unit in the southeast at the end of turn 3, and would start messing around with the boss group if left unrecruited. Her combat isn't nearly as dominant as Soth in Part 1, but her ability to steal, on top of her personal pass skill, lets her weave in and out of enemy formations to grab items. In this chapter in particular, Heather can reach the southwestern village by moving through the volunteer instead of killing them, as well as collect the 2 coins at the map. I end up with a line of enemies chasing after me as Braum catches up with Nephany in the southeast, but I'm able to set up for the boss kill before they can overwhelm us. In fact, one of these enemies is a volunteer with a coin, which Heather is able to steal before the boss kill. I may not go for a Wrath Sweep build for Nephany in Radiant Dawn either, but it at least proves to be useful here. In setting her below 30% HP, she gets plus 50 crits, and with a crit, she exactly kills the boss after ship damage from Braum. We'll continue jumping around perspectives in the near future, but we've now roped the countryside crew into Valencia's conflict, so we'll see more Nephany and Heather action just yet. Shadow Dragon. Once again, Marth sets out for Arcanea with the Fire Emblem in hand, going through the Lefkandith Gauntlet. The setup is the same, with the boss commanding a reluctant Minerva and her White Wings to fend off Marth as he passes through the mountains, and a village to visit in an alcove off to the side. Since I already knew Minerva's group won't fight us, I prepared for an even more aggressive approach, forging up an Armor Slayer to give our Cavaliers a good matchup against the general boss. This still proved to be useful, but it did not get used as I initially planned. My first idea was to rush my cavalry south, defeating the boss by turn 4 so that I could warp Marth directly to the seize point after visiting the village. This would use one warp use, like an FE1, but dramatically cut several turns while only foregoing a couple kills. However, I learned that this map actually has Cavalier reinforcements that I was too fast for in FE1, but Shadow Dragon makes sure that you have to deal with them. Once a unit reaches the halfway point of the map, a Cavalier will show up from each of the 4 forts. One has a Rider's Bane, and hard mode reinforcements act the same turn they show up, so let's just say my initial plan of rushing my cavalry south didn't work out so well, and I ended up just walking around the long way. To keep up the suspense, Shadow Dragon has Minerva stick around until turn 6 this time. This did make me nervous, thinking that maybe this time she would turn aggressive, but in the end she stayed passive, and all I had to protect Marth against was a few generic flyers. Lena and Sheeta did pretty well while flying around the mountains, and Wolf was even able to one-shot the Pegasus Knights, although this did leave him far behind everyone wrapping around the west. In a similar faraway position is Bantu, who Marth recruits after visiting the village. I still don't quite understand his Firestone stat boosts, but I at least can see his attack value now, even though he won't be reaching any combat this chapter. For the west, I had led with General Sedgar and my cavalry, intent on blocking the reinforcements. They had to fight through one wave of cavaliers, but with Lena and Cheetah sneaking down from the mountains for support, I was able to get a unit on the forts before getting overwhelmed by another set. From there, it was mostly just a lot of walking to escort Marth to the throne. While the sudden cavalier reinforcements were frustrating at first, I'll recognize that they fit in with Shadow Dragon's design of adding challenge to its original game, which also scales very harshly as you go up the new difficulty modes. In addition to same-turn reinforcements, the main change by these modes seems to be higher enemy quality, which gets really absurd up on Lunatic. And when the first chapters are all about just learning basic combat and movement, absurd enemy quality makes for quite the rough experience, where you need to carefully use everyone to just barely get by fighting just a couple pirates. The new base completely changes this though, with reclassing and forging giving the player new ways to boost a unit's performance to match up better against these stronger enemies. So, like the Tellius games, but with an even stronger forge, in a context where effective weapons are very important, and free reclassing just opens up so many options. I'm only on hard mode, so the base doesn't feel necessary, but I think it still marks a noticeable shift in gameplay, in which I can now dominate enemies in cool ways, like having Lena fly around with a big lance and Okoing enemies with Wolf. I kind of like this, as FE1 chapters didn't feel too different from each other, and now the early chapters have a distinct identity. However, to me the identity of the first chapters is being tedious and not fun, because all the cool new elements aren't unlocked until after chapter 3. I think holding off on the base is fair on lower difficulty modes, as to not overwhelm new players, but the unfortunate consequence is that the higher difficulty modes have a very intimidating start. Like, I tried playing on Fiendish mode once, but got a bad impression and gave up very quickly. At least on hard mode though, the opening chapters were fine to get through, and I'm now having a lot of fun using the new tools. I may not have gotten to do the warp skip strats, but I still used the Forged Armor Slayer to just about one-round the general boss, setting up the kill for Lena. Again, Minerva and the White Wings may not join just yet, but it seems our current flyers are more than sufficient. I really would like a Master Seal though, so we can promote Lena for a true Draco Knight. Surely we'll get one soon, right? New Mystery of the Emblem. Marth sets out for the Fane of Ramen, where the next Astral Shard lies among other treasure being ransacked by thieves. As before, we must push through a forest to reclaim the temple in the northeast, getting as much treasure as we can from the thieves as they move to escape in the north, while Astrum's heroes guard the bridge in the northwest. This time, I knew there would be a fire dragon in the west, and I was under the impression that the Blizzard Tome would be effective, so I forged it up in preparation. Once again, the dancer Fina and Myrmidon Nevere show up in the forest, but this time our rush to save the two is even more dire, as the stronger thieves threaten to two-shot Fina, and 3 hunters are now in the mix to fend off her flyers. I mean, they make an attempt, but a lot of the thieves aren't aggressive, and Sheeta, Pala, and Draco Knight Sirius can make quick work of the hunters on player phase, so long as we keep them out of range of the other hunters on enemy phase. So while the treasure hoist goes smoothly in the east, the real threat ends up being in the west. In Mystery of the Emblem, I assumed the trigger for the fire dragon was specifically waiting on the cave tile, but apparently even approaching the opening to the cave will cause it to show up. So while I had Luke, Ryan, and Ubello charge directly towards the cave, they got jump scared by the dragon, and I had just barely kept them out of range. I was excited to follow this up by having Ubello destroy them with Blizzard, but as it turns out, Blizzard is not effective against fire dragons, so I had to team up for the kill anyways. I could swear I saw somewhere in Mystery of the Emblem that Blizzard is strong against fire, but maybe I'm wrong, or maybe it's something New Mystery changed to add difficulty. The fire dragon wasn't the last of the Western group's problems though, as the reinforcements from the forts by Astrum gave them plenty to deal with while the Eastern group trudged through the forest. I'm pretty sure I messed up some positioning to have Fina dance for Marth the maximum times, but at least I never had to hold him back, with my flyers defeating the hunters and thieves to clear a path just fine. While New Mystery's added difficulty modes have a similar approach to Shadow Dragon, I think the addition of the prologue chapters makes insane enemy quality scaling have a different impact on the early game's identity. Now the player can get used to the game in original maps, and the base can be fully unlocked for all the remake chapters. With the prologue maps having a unique, simple design, and the player having the opportunity to train any units of their choosing during this time, I would ironically say that Chapter 1 is the first noticeable shift in gameplay and narrative. I like this because all the remake chapters can be engaged with using all the new features, meaning you can have fun crushing enemies on lower difficulty modes, and have many options for handling Lunatic's huge enemies. Some specific use cases that come to mind are reclassing units into Archer and forging bows to counter the tough Draco Knights, and reclassing units into Flyers to work around all the forest terrain. I also liked the prologue chapters on hard mode, with tiny maps that were very charming, and perfect for teaching the player by forcing them to go through specific motions. However, going through specific motions, and huge enemy quality, don't go very well together in my opinion, so New Mystery unfortunately falls under the category of early game ruined by the highest difficulty mode. To see for myself, I went back and attempted the prologue on Lunatic, and my Mage Chris setup was unable to get past the first map, where it's just one soldier and Jagan. I tried with a few more setups, and I was able to get past a couple maps with Mercenary and Fighter, but I was left feeling like there was one solution, and if I couldn't figure it out, I literally would not be able to progress. I'm sure this appeals to some players, and I do like that this makes for a distinct identity for the early chapters. I'm just not sure it's an identity that I like. At least for the higher difficulty modes. I think it's quite funny otherwise. By the end of the map, my western group was starting to get a little overwhelmed by the reinforcements, but my northern group set up Marth to seize before anything got too problematic. The boss kill went to Sheeta, who I actually got to level 10 and could have insta-promoted beforehand, but I'm feeling eager for strength levels and will likely hold off under Master Seals just a bit longer. After seizing, Jagan gives us some lore about Naga, the deity who this temple was dedicated to and original wielder of the Fire Emblem and the Blade of Light. More concerning though, Wendell also approaches Queen and offers one of his hats to help with her cold. I don't know why all these mages are trying to make us put on their headgear, but no, I will not wear it. Awakening. Crum reports back to Arena Feryx, where he learns that Plegian soldiers attacked Elis, taking over the capital and capturing Emerin. And so, with the pressing matter of reclaiming his sister from evil forces, our next steps are, of course, to wander Elis and help out random people in 2 paralogs. First, we encounter a group of bandits blocking a trade route and taking money from travelers. When Crom arrives, the bandits start attacking a village, so we must send someone to save them in the northeast, while everyone else handles the main combat against the bandits in the south. The village is guarded by the merchant Anna, who starts a lot stronger than engages Anna, but she can still only last a few turns if she doesn't dodge enough attacks. As such, I rush Lonku to assist her and visit the village, after helping clear out the first big group of enemies at the bridge. The starting positions in the forest prevent everyone from being able to reach an enemy turn 1, but I'm still able to set up a kill for Donal, have Cordelia fly over to hold the first choke point, and have Lonku fly over the gap to immediately take out a mage. This put me in a good position to comfortably take on both enemies coming from the northwest and southeast for a few turns, giving kills to Gaius and Donal while waiting for Lonku to finish helping Anna in the northeast. This multi-front approach sounds interesting, but the enemies are pretty weak, so everything after the aggressive turn 1 ends up being pretty chill. Anna dodges enough attacks to survive, Lonku visits the village for a physics staff, and Stahl and Crom work together to safely instigate the boss group. I think they could have killed Stahl if they all attacked him and landed, but we have weapon triangle advantage against inaccurate axes, and I successfully split their attacks, so there ended up being no risk. The boss kill got Donald just below level 8, and Cordelia one-rounded the final archer to end the map. With the trade route secured, we move on to the next village in need, which is being attacked by Risen. The village is safe for now, but some villagers weren't let back in, and are now attempting to flee to safety. So while we must rout the Risen, we also have to keep the villagers safe, who start across a gap and quickly get surrounded. This shouldn't be a huge issue, as we have multiple flyers who can immediately reach them. However, these villagers are absolute fools and continue their dash southwest, regardless of how many Risen we defeat in the east. So these villagers end up creating a fairly strict time pressure, in which we must defeat enemies by the western mountain pass before the villagers make it too far, while also leaving behind a sufficient force in the east to make sure the villagers don't just immediately die. I have Lonku fly directly to the mountains, while everyone else pulls off a big player phase in the east to clear the first group of enemies. Once again, I'm looking to set up kills for Donald every turn if possible, and by the end of the map I'm able to get him to level 9. After clearing the first group in the east, I have Cordelia continue to the southeast to provoke the boss, while everyone else follows the villagers or sticks around to clean up enemies approaching from the northwest. It got a little close, but Lonku was ultimately able to defeat the western enemies before the villagers got in range, and I even got a lucky crit with Cordelia at the end to one-down the boss as soon as they got off their mountain. After the battle, we collect all our important rewards from the villagers, being a Seraph Robe and the incredible One Might log and ladle weapons, and then finally move on to our main mission of saving Emerin. This takes Crom through the Pluggian Desert, where he spots a conflict and prepares for battle. Upon starting the map, we see the Manihite Naui running away from Pluggian forces, as well as the mercenary Gregor, who was just trying to help protect her. They end in the center of the map, so like Mystery of the Emblem, we end up needing to push through terrain to reach 2 new allies, who would quickly find themselves overwhelmed. Like Shadow Dragon's Bantu, Naui's Dragonstone makes her stronger than she initially seems, but her low HP and speed limits her base combat. Her main strength comes from huge growths that let her sweep large groups of enemies with 1-2 range after being trained. However, I have another Manihite I plan to use, and you might be able to guess that I already have an upcoming mercenary, so Naui and Gregor's contributions will just be to stay safe this map. In addition to our flyers, mages can also freely traverse desert terrain, so I'm able to pull off an aggressive turn 1 that clears the enemies in the starting position. I have Muriel carry Queen to clear the northwest, while everyone else gets the northeastern kills on player phase. From there, I have Cordelia fly west to visit a village, while Lonku and Stahl lead the path south, making room for Naui and Gregor to get to safety. We're now getting to games that I'm really familiar with, so I feel pretty confident saying that Awakening is in a more unique place with how its gameplay is split up. On one hand, we do get the first promotion items in this part like other games, which can help units stay ahead of the curve going forward. However, I would say the more notable shift is closer to a halfway mark, like in Genealogy, after the narrative jumps forward and most enemies are promoted. Once you get to that point, I find Awakening becomes difficult to approach like other games, because training a full balanced team against dense enemy formations is difficult when all the enemies are also really strong. So, unlike some other games, I actually find Awakening's early game to be the more fun section, since I like the process of training up a team. I also like the recurring Wyvern Knights, which serve a similar role to New Mysteries Draco Knights and Blazing Blades Pegasus Knights. If you're only interested in juggernauting with a few units though, I would actually pinpoint the main shift all the way back to Chapter 4, in which units have had the opportunity to become self-sufficient, paralogs open up for training, and the shop opens up for tonics and forging. I also think Chapter 4 is a big moment for Lunatic mode regardless of your approach, with higher enemy quality and quantity disproportionately impacting the difficulty of the first few chapters. I played up through Chapter 6 on Lunatic to see for myself, and yeah, even though it's just barbarians and soldiers, those barbarians and soldiers are really strong, and involving a full team had me risking units getting one-rounded, if not O-code. So overall, I think Awakening does a good job of keeping a unique and fun early game on all difficulty modes, with the exception of specifically the first few chapters on Lunatic, and you might not like where the game transitions if you want to train a full team. I will certainly do my best to keep training everyone on hard mode though, and the end of this map has me feeling pretty good. I got Donald to level 10 and ready for a reclass, with Queen, Crom, Stall, Lonku, Gaius, and Cordelia trained to competency as well. I took a bit of a risky approach at the end to keep rushing forward, getting most of the boss group kills on player phase, and even though one Dark Mage was left alive, they couldn't kill anyone, so I was safe. Then on the last turn, I just had the Dark Mage to kill, the last village to visit, and a boss kill to cook up with Lonku's ladle. Fates. Birthright. With Izana saved, and good fortune foretold for Takumi and Ryoma, Queen continues her search, leading us through the forests of Mokushu. There we re-encounter the Norian Dark Mage Zola, who Queen decides to spare and lets him tag along. It turns out the real enemy for the chapter is Kotaro of Mokushu, who sided with Nor and decides to lead his ninja forces against our Hoshiden army. The map lives up to the chapter's setting, with forest terrain and woods cluttering the area, and a lot of ninjas. There's also spike traps that we can deactivate with the Dragon Veins, but that's kind of a fruitless endeavor because they just keep coming back, so the main focus is on fighting through the dense, dodgy, debuffing enemy formations. To get off to a strong start, I decided to defeat all the enemies near the starting area turn 1. We're not trapped in a room like last chapter, but I still think if you don't make progress right away, it's pretty easy to feel stuck in place. I had to lower my action economy by pairing up units to reach the enemies and reach 1-round thresholds, but I was still able to get all the kills. Tsubaki paired up with Setsuna to fly her around and provide the speed to 1-round ninjas, Queen paired up with Kaze to demolish the spear fighters, and everyone else teamed up with dual strikes for the other kills. From here, my plan was to split up between a northern and southern trail moving east, and to help us with this aggressive approach, Takumi shows up turn 2. We see that he is safe, but feeling a little not himself, so Azura sinks some sense into Takumi before officially recruiting him. Rather than focusing on speed like Setsuna, Takumi's all about hitting accurately and hard, with his personal Fujin Yumi having a lot of might, while also letting him ignore terrain movement penalties. I don't have plans for him in this route, but he and his feisty attitude will still be relevant to Birthright's story. He has a good matchup in this chapter, with the potential to one-shot ninjas, but the MVP ended up being Kaze for sure. Jacob and Setsuna teamed up in the north, but Kaze led the south on his own. I had damage boosted him in hopes of being able to sweep the ninjas with the throwing club, and while it ended up being a few points short of Okoing, this ended up being good. Kaze wouldn't get much experience from the kills anyway, and leaving a ton of enemies at low HP set up for easy player face kills the next turn. And so, the main loop ended up being move Kaze east to weaken enemies, distribute kills to Mozu and Rinka, which cleared the way for Kaze to keep moving east. This felt a little repetitive after a few turns, but it was worth it for the sake of finishing Mozu's training arc. Like Blazing Blade, Fates has its own pre-game, which you can skip on future playthroughs. They are obviously distinct as tutorial maps, played before you pick a side with no preps or My Castle, but for the sake of a more interesting discussion, I'm willing to analyze each route as its own experience. For Birthright, we did just accomplish one of our primary goals of finding Takumi this chapter, but I would actually put the end of Birthright's early game at chapter 13. There we'll conclude the Hoshiden Brother Search arc entirely, get some strong promoted units, and the tier 2 armory and rod shops will unlock. It's hard for me to clearly pinpoint a big shift though, because Fates is always giving the player a lot of mini power spikes. There's basically a new My Castle feature, like the shops and mess hall to unlock or upgrade every chapter, enemies drop Master Seals every once in a while, and level 10 is a nice goal for everyone to reach, even if you aren't going to insta-promote them because of the skill system. This is true for Awakening too, of course, but I don't know, I feel like I care about the Fates level 10 skills more. Archers getting Quick Draw, Cavaliers getting Shelter, and even Ninjas getting Poison Strike are all nice benefits to train for. So I think Birthright progresses well enough, but I will say that I don't really love its first chapters, because the maps are just fine to me. The combat is pretty tame, but there's a lot of it with decently sized route maps, and none of the Dragon Vein gimmicks feel relevant or engaging to me. I like that there's at least some time pressure to rescue chests in chapters 7 and 9, and keeping a strong pace requires breaking through some dense enemy formations at the start. I also know that these route maps can be interesting in an LTC, but I don't think that there's enough engaging combat, enemy formations, or objectives for a standard playthrough. At the very least, I'll say these maps are nice for funneling experience into your favorite units. By the time I got close to Kotaro, I got Mozu to level 10, and was able to focus on cleaning up. I knew reinforcements would show up in the south, but not exactly where. So to avoid getting stuck in a loop of not being able to route before more reinforcements showed up, I left my filler combat units in the back, while the lead combat units collected the rescue chest and took out Kotaro. I really don't know what I want to do with Mozu with her newfound strength, but I'm looking forward to figuring something out as we move on to hopefully more interesting chapters. Conquest. With Fort Dragonfall reclaimed, Queen continues her journey to capture Notre Sagesse, leading her to Port Dia to obtain a ship. We're still in Norian territory, but Hoshiden forces swarm the docks upon our arrival, led by our brother Takumi. Like in Birthright, he's rather aggressive at first, but this time a song from Azura will not suffice, and we must engage in a full-scale battle to subdue the Hoshiden army. This is Conquest's famous defend map, with walls and ballista to protect the starting area, while enemies rush towards us from multiple fronts, led by Takumi's retainers Oboro and Hinata. There's a lot of Sky Knights that will attempt to fly past our defenses, and an aggressive approach seems like it would spread the army too thin. However, I took the time to plan out a strategy that will conquer our biggest problems while still holding the defend point, with the help of our new powerful units. Because of the terrain, the non-flying enemies are forced to attack at 4 fronts, with each having a nearby village. The northeast starts with the least pressure, so I leave it alone to start, and I take a couple turns to get Odin to fight the 2 Oni savages in the northwest. The main focus then is on the southern paths, so that I can take out both Oboro's group in the southeast and Hinata's group in the southwest right away. From there, I want to continue pushing southwest to reach Takumi, so I can prevent him from triggering his Dragon Vein, claim his precious elixir, and most importantly, prove my epicness as a gamer. The key to my initial success in the southwest comes from last chapter's boss and our new recruit, Haitaka. He has great physical combat bases that let him hit hard with a steel lance, and I use his unique rally defense access here to further boost Silas's bulk. I positioned the 2 to be in attack stance while the ninjas could only reach Silas, and it worked out for Silas to defeat both ninjas and spear fighters on the enemy phase, with a javelin attack and a big dual strike from Haitaka. Meanwhile, Queen tanked in the southeast with support from Jacob, one-shotting her Oni savages with a Dragonstone. With that, I had broken out of our starting area and defeated most all the initial enemies turn 1, and was able to instigate Takumi's retainers turn 2. Our key to success here is Suzume, the Shrine Maiden we captured last chapter. My goal is to maximize her staff experience, to rush learning Rally Luck at level 10, and then Rally Magic at level 5 promoted, so she can support some very important magic users. For now, she's just a healer, but it was still very useful that she could heal everyone in the southwest, while Jacob and Elise were busy elsewhere. And of course, we're not done with new recruits just yet, with turn 3 giving us a wave of support from our big sister Camilla and her retainers Baruka and Selena. It may seem hard to believe, but Camilla is here to stay. She's in an amazing position, with great personal bases and growths, fast XP gain for pre-promotes, and the Malignite class that lets her fly around while killing things with axes and tomes. You would think I'd prefer to focus on her retainers, who you actually need to build up to be great, but no, I'm actually really excited to use Camilla this run, and I have just the plan in mind for her. With Dark Mage as her reclass option, I used last chapter's Heart Seal to put her into Sorcerer. Her personal magic isn't the highest, but her speed is still fantastic, and Sorcerer gives her the damage to destroy a lot of enemies, while also removing her bow weakness. I put her to use immediately, patching our hole in the northeast, and using Nyx's pair-up to one-round even the spear fighters. She's more than fine on her own, so I moved Baruka and Selena to help with the push towards Takumi. I know I dismissed the 2, but I do actually plan to use them a bit, with Selena having a cool tie-in to the marathon as a whole, and Baruka being great for giving Wyvern access to other units. And I of course use them here while it's all hands on dock, providing some much-needed filler combat and pair-up utility against the multiple waves of reinforcements impeding our path to Takumi. While I'm not as high on this map as some others, I still think it's a cool climactic chapter, in which focusing on a unit to get them more stats, a level 10 skill, and potentially an early promotion or reclass pays off just in time for a uniquely challenging chapter. I also think Camilla's group joining is a lot more exciting than when Takumi joined in Birthright, and with this chapter being the first opportunity to use the Heart and Master Seal item drops, I think Conquest lines up well with the other games, as having a big gameplay shift a quarter way through. That said, I'll acknowledge that the hype for Conquest Chapter 10 might be influenced by community opinion, and I'm not actually sure if it's more or less exciting than the other early Conquest maps. Like, they all have challenging formations, with hard-hitting and or debuffing enemies that make you engage your whole army, in which utilizing attack stance to push for damage is a good strat. We already had side objectives that made you play aggressive in Chapter 8, and Chapter 10 isn't really that much bigger than its surrounding maps. And from a narrative standpoint, the premise for this chapter isn't special, and I don't think we even get to a big moment until, like, Chapter 15. Before then, we're basically just doing random quests to prove our loyalty to Garen. They each have their own build-up and resolution for reaching and then beating the Hoshidan forces in question, but this seems to be in line with the My Castle approach of continuously handing out new things to consider, rather than building up to something big. Which I think is fine, it's just not the most encouraging for players that aren't immediately hooked and could use something to look forward to. This doesn't apply to me, of course, because as we established, I am a super awesome gamer, and was able to take out Takumi even before he was supposed to activate his Dragon Vein to lower the map's water. Because of this, I was able to maintain choke points against non-flyers in the final turns, which ended up being super helpful in fending off the northwestern reinforcements. Because I pulled back most of my units to help with that section, I ended up not being able to kill a few enemies in the south, but I still came pretty close to routing by the final turn. A fun experience, and I'm looking forward to what our MVPs Camilla and Suzume can do as we set sail to our next challenges. Revelation. With their conflict with Fuga resolved, we leave the Wind Tribe behind and head towards the prosperous city Izumo. They were greeted by the Archduke Izana, who turns out to actually be the trickster Norian mage Zola in disguise. The imposter uses the classic ice bomb trick to encase the entire village with snow before running to the entrance of the palace. Our goal then is to defeat Zola and reclaim the palace's seize points, but to get there we have a lot of snow to fight through, while also fighting whatever enemies may be hiding underneath. Which is a lot for a completionist approach, but with a little bit of cheating, I can still make it work in a fast pace. Okay, it's not really cheating, but my secret for making this chapter more engaging than tedious is having the map pulled up to make sure I don't miss any enemies. I don't really mind getting jump scared by multiple enemies being revealed after blindly destroying a square of snow, and I actually think that can be fun to handle with our small deployment size of 6 units. However, you'll quickly realize that every enemy drops an item, which not only includes useful weapons, but also one of each stat booster. So you're rewarded for defeating every enemy, and to be sure you don't miss any, you either have to destroy every single piece of snow, or just know where the enemies are ahead of time. To speed up the process, I split my army into 2 after getting past the starting area, with Jacob, Tsubaki, and Rinka making a path in the west, while Queen, Azura, and our new diviner from the Wind Tribe, Hayato, made a path going north. The western group was decently bulky, and they were fine to rotate around frontliners, while Jacob made sure no one got too low on HP. My northern group didn't have a healer at all, but Queen could tank so well with the Dragonstone that Vulneraries and Azura's personal skill were enough to keep her healthy. Also, it turns out that Hayato is really strong on this map, and with just a Fire Forge and some tonics, he was able to one-round a lot of enemies before they could even get an attack off. Which for Revelation standards feels pretty impressive for someone who isn't Corrin or Jacob. High enemy quality is going to be a persistent aspect of Revelation, and I actually think it gets even more dramatic after enemies promote. What makes the early chapters stand out to me, instead, is a small army size contrasted with large maps. Normally, Fire Emblem is pretty good with either starting you with an army of 8 or so units, or quickly introducing characters until you get to that point. And in the games where that's not the case, like Gaiden and New Mysteries Prologue, the maps are scaled down and have you fighting just a small cluster of enemies while you get used to combat. In Revelation though, we've already had the pre-Branch of Fate chapters to learn how to play, so these big maps feel really weird. Combat isn't challenging because there's so much XP to be funneled into Corrin and Jacob, but positioning can't be interesting because we only have a few units to work with. So we end up with multiple small bursts of combat over a large map, which we're encouraged to fully explore for maximum rewards. It just so happens that I really enjoy this with my aggressive completionist playstyle, and I don't even think it's like bad, but I can totally understand why other players don't have fun with this unique stretch of maps. Like Conquest, there's not a big narrative shift until much later, but I can say that from at least a gameplay perspective, this chapter is a fairly clear end to Revelation's early game. Our deployment slots will open up dramatically, and this chapter gives us a lot of new tools to work with, just before we start fighting promoted enemies. Lastly, I should mention that Fates' Lunatic mode doesn't impact its early chapters as drastically as other games, and I think that's awesome. Enemies are stronger, and in some cases in higher quantity or smarter, but not to the point where a specific setup feels necessary. Revelation probably has it worst, with a lot of new recruits dealing minimum damage at base. As I showed last chapter though, pair up and attack stance make it easy to give anyone competent combat for training. So if you're struggling with any of Fates' early maps, it's not because they have unbalanced enemies that you have to get through, you're just being presented with the challenges of your route of choosing. Which is good, I like that for Fates. Though the journey was long, I end up getting both groups to meet up by Zola around turn 15. My pathing was a little off, and after some wiki map cross-referencing, I realized I needed Queen and Tsubaki to make a detour at the end to finish the last enemy covered in snow. Jacob took this time to fight Zola's mages across an icy wall though, so by the time Queen caught up, I was ready to break the final ice and make a break for the seize point. Nosferatu made it a little awkward, but I was able to set up the Zola kill for Tsubaki, and with the Sing, have Queen seize. After making it into the palace, we see that Leo is not so forgiving of Zola as we were in Birthright, but Leo quickly leaves, and like Birthright, we end up reuniting with and recruiting Takumi. And to end things off, we speak with the real Izana, who divines that Queen must meet the dragon, giving his life in the process. Thanks for your important sacrifice, Izana. We will never forget it. Shadows of Valentia. Now that Seabound Shrine's Necrodragons are defeated, Celica moves to explore its dungeon. This time, we can collect some coral to trade later, which involves cutting down every piece of grass in sight. After trashing the environment, I make sure to do one encounter like in Gaiden, and I gather all three groups together to make the most of it. This results in a lot of enemies, but at this point, Bonewalkers aren't all too scary, and I'm able to take this opportunity to quickly distribute many kills. The main goals to reach by the end of the act are level 7 for Saber and Leon, and level 10 for Jenny, with each being 2 to 3 levels away. These terrors don't give a ton of experience, but every bit matters. After the first skirmish, I collect more coral, give all 3 skill fountains to Leon, and move on to the dungeon's depths. This time, we're able to sneak past the gargoyles to open the chest and retrieve the blessed sword, but doing so triggers the gargoyles to chase after us, so we end up fighting them yet again. While this encounter was surprisingly mildly tough in Gaiden, it ended up going by even faster here, with our army being higher leveled and the blessed sword giving Saber stronger damage outputs. All it took this time was killing some enemies on player phase, setting up a defensive formation to safely fight the rest on enemy phase, then finishing the last kills on the next player phase. With the gargoyles cleared, we see that Shadows of Valentia also added 2 two-use fountains. I give both points of resistance to Celica, but I hold off on the experience fountain for now, and head back to our main journey. We've got 2 more boat maps left, which are technically called pirate raids, but the enemy composition is more varied now. In the 4th raid, I once again lead with Celica at the choke point, but she does much better this time, one-rounding brigands with the steel sword until she missed an attack. Leon also did better, actually landing his attacks and learning the curve shot combat art from the iron bow, for more accuracy on player phase. With this improved performance, I was able to have Celica break through the choke point turn 2, trading herself the leather shield to tank the mercenaries, in spite of being doubled. From there, it just took a couple more turns to push everyone else forward and mop the deck of its final enemies. Overall, my thoughts on Gaiden all apply to Shadows of Valentia, and because it's such a true remake, there aren't too many big changes to talk about. I would say the expanded narrative in Shadows of Valentia helps though, giving a more distinct tone in both Alm and Celica's routes, and a more dramatic moment when transitioning from one act to another. From a gameplay perspective, one of the big added elements is the Forge, and in waiting to introduce it until each route's second act, I think this also helps the early maps feel distinct. The Forge opens up some pretty strong options, like the Killer Bow and even a personal weapon for Celica, but by keeping those locked until later, we can just take these first maps to train up units and get used to the game's basic systems. With the mercenaries defeated, we then move on to our final boat map, which features many Arcanists. The big change to this map is the boss and one other Arcanist getting the Meyer spell, which has 3 range and hits much harder than Miasma. Stalling at a choke point won't work forever, but my high resistance units like Jenny and May were able to survive a turn or two on their own, while Celica's Recover and Jenny's Physic helped keep everyone alive. I sent Jenny north with Celica and May with Saber and Leon west, which ended up working well. Most of the Arcanists went west, where May could counterattack multiple enemies for solid damage, while Celica and Jenny dealt with the boss mostly isolated in the northeast. I was able to get the boss out of the way turn 2, and the Arcanists are very trigger happy when it comes to healing their allies, so despite being offensively threatening at first, the map ended up being pretty safe. On hard mode, these Arcanists gave even more experience due to being higher leveled, so I'm able to reach all my level goals just fine, even being able to give some kills to other units like Celica and Bowie. I like how this aspect of hard mode makes the experience of training up your units of choice more satisfying, and I don't feel like I have to laser focus on just Grey or just Saber to get a promotion without grinding. And since hard mode doesn't ramp up the difficulty too much, I don't find these early maps frustrating to play without new aspects like the Forge available yet. So to me, this is a difficulty mode that actually adds to the early maps, rather than detracts. Yay for echoes! Another big hooray is that Jenny reached her ambitious goal of level 10 at the end of the map. It took many Nosferatu hits to get to this point, but with the 2 experience fountains I saved earlier, I'm now able to promote her alongside Saber and Leon. The Myrmidon and Sniper promotions are great of course, giving a strong combat boost, but Jenny's promotion to Saint means some really nice extra bulk, passive healing for adjacent allies, and access to the Seraphim spell, so she can hit hard and accurately. With our promotions complete, we can finally dock our ship at Sophia Harbor, leaving the sea and boat maps behind us for good. Here we can trade in our coral from the Seabound Shrine for silver, and check in with the White Wings Palla and Katria. We'll help with their quest to find their sister Est later, but for now, we move on to Sophia Castle, which seems to be a sad and familiar sight for Celica. She must put her emotions aside though, as she and Saber are ambushed by a cantor, whereupon the game's cutest character comes to her aid. He tragically doesn't join our army yet, but he fights alongside us as we drive off the cantor and Arcanists. The battle takes place at Sophia Gate, but it's much less exciting than Act 1's final battle, using just the bottom half of the map and only giving a few enemies so that the Masked Knight has a quick chance to show off. With Saber promoted and Celica well trained, I'm able to safely grab most of the kills for myself, but this is the one case where I'm okay with an ally stealing experience, because he's just so awesome. On one hand, I like how this battle adds a little more excitement to the end of Celica's first act, because Alm got a huge moment in reclaiming Sophia Castle for his route. On the other hand though, this cantor doesn't add much, like we already know some evil mages are trying to capture Celica. I already think the expansion of Sophia Harbor did a decent job of concluding Celica's first journey, with even more NPCs welcoming her group and celebrating her expulsion of the pirates, and even the Coral guy giving extra payoff for the Seabound Shrine side journey. Still, I think it's neat, and I love getting to see the Masked Knight, even though I know others do not feel the same. For now though, he goes his own way after ensuring our safety, and we make our way inside Sophia Castle. We hear about the Deliverance's fight against Regelian forces, pick up a steel lance and iron shield I left behind in Act 1, and finally go to speak with Mycen, who leads Celica to reunite with Alm on the balcony. The two share a touching moment, completely ignoring all the oranges we could be picking up, but it gets even worse as an argument breaks out and the two part ways. Going forward, they'll continue their own paths for peace, with Alm choosing the battlefield and Celica Milla's succor. Three Houses. With Miklon defeated, we've reclaimed the Lance of Ruin, but before Rhea can get too mad about it, Seteth springs a new predicament on us. His sister Flayn has gone missing, and so now it's our top priority to find her. Seteth believes she must have been kidnapped in the monastery, so we must investigate suspicious locations such as Bernie's room and the kitchen, as well as suspicious individuals such as Alois, who is afraid of the fishing pond. While we sort through our many dead ends, I take all the weeks to explore in the monastery. I end with B+ professor rank, some great weapon rank on Queen, and enough support to recruit Felix from the Blue Lions. I mostly want him on the team to support Sylvain as an adjutant for their special damage boost, but he should make for a strong and speedy sword user in chapters where I do deploy him. Apart from Felix, Marianne's back for mission assistance, and we have several promotions. Caspar and Petra got Armor Knight for the base defense, while also getting Brigand and Thief respectively. Sylvain unlocked Cavalier as a second option to Armor Knight, Bernie promoted into Archer, and Dorothea into Mage. Afterwards, we finally get a real lead on Flayn, with rumors of a Reaper leading us to the Professor Yuritsa's room. There we find Manuela unconscious, and while Edelgard takes Manuela to the infirmary, everyone else follows a hidden underground path. At the end, we find that Flayn and another girl have been taken captive by the Death Knight, and it's up to us to clear the chamber and rescue them. The Death Knight is even stronger than before, and to reach him we have two paths to wrap around, while also considering a couple chests and stealable magic staves. The western path has more open space and most of the enemies, while the eastern path uses warp tiles to create a hallway leading to a room that lets us warp around even more. Taking this map at an aggressive pace is pretty ambitious, but I have a very unique and original approach in mind to take it on. The first room in the west has a pretty dense group of enemies, and to take full advantage of our turn 1 stride, I always like to defeat or gambit all of them turn 1. Edelgard isn't available this chapter, so our damage output is lower than normal, but I can still make it work. To start, Queen can reach a Myrmidon, and weaken 4 enemies with the Blaze Gambit. Then I have Hubert defeat an Armor Knight, Caspar defeat an Archer, and Bernie defeat another Archer. This leaves just a Soldier and the last faraway Archer, and I can reach both of them with the Assault Troop Gambit from Petra, successfully leaving it so everyone's far forward and safe on the enemy phase. While this group continued to take on larger enemy formations together in the northwestern rooms, the few units I left behind had a more movement-focused challenge in the east. Their goal was to quickly reach the control room in the northeast, where they could activate warp tiles, some of which connect to the west, and some that connect to the mini-sections with side objectives. This means there's a lot of ground to cover, so we need to efficiently move through the eastern hallways while defeating the enemy archers. The trio to tackle this is Archer Ash to one-round the enemy archers and collect chests with Lockpick, Mage Dorothea to defeat the first Armor Knight and heal Ash, and Cavalier Sylvain to help fight reinforcements. This group is also a great first showing for the positional combat arts we learned from mastering beginner classes, lining up Dorothea's drawback and Sylvain's reposition to constantly give each other a boost forward. Sylvain having high movement and Canto was particularly useful, letting him reposition for the same unit 2 turns in a row. This let the trio reach the control room by the time the western group reached a warp tile to send units over, and Ash continued to be useful as he and Petra rushed around at the end to open both chests and steal the northern magic staff before confronting the Death Knights. I think Three Houses is in a similar position to Fates, with small bursts of progression every chapter, rather than one big shift. Narratively, we're just doing various missions for our totally not evil leader, like Conquest, and new elements of the hub world are always expanding our options for the gameplay. However, Three Houses goes even further, with units unlocking new skills and combat arts alongside their weapon ranks, multiple low-level class promotions, and class mastery skills. Put together, these aspects means each unit is constantly being rewarded for being used in combat. To me, this makes Three Houses' early game incredibly satisfying. Balancing everyone's experience, weapon ranks, and class mastery progression to get into beginner classes by around Chapter 3, intermediate by Chapter 5, and then advanced by Chapter 8 gives me consistent payoff for my time spent optimizing battles and professor rank, and there's always something for each unit to look forward to. This slows down once units do reach their advanced class, generally lining up after Chapter 7's exciting mock battle, and when the story starts getting more serious in Chapter 8. But I like this early game unit progression during the entire time. If you don't find joy in this level of micromanagement though, then I can understand not finding the first chapters quite as interesting. And unfortunately, Three Houses' first chapters are yet another victim of difficulty modes. Specifically, I don't like the combat of chapters 1 through 4 on Maddening, before units get into intermediate classes and forging unlocks. Everyone's stuck with 4 move, with minimal skills and low spell uses, which makes for a pretty unpleasant experience considering the competition. Even fighters and soldiers, 2 or 1 round many units, and poison strike through range archers, and pass thieves, threaten any enemy phase activity. That said, I do think some of the strategies this creates are kind of funny. Training everyone to get into Armor Knight so they can actually live multiple hits, buying training bows and making Iron Bow pluses so everyone can safely weaken enemies, and burning so many lance uses on Tempest Lance and Vengeance are all iconic experiences to me now, making for some very tense gameplay just to get rid of basic enemies. Not unapproachable by any means, but I do find I have to get through the first few chapters until I really start enjoying Three Houses on Maddening. Thankfully, we are now at a point where I feel ready to take on these tough enemies. So ready, in fact, that I could defeat the Death Knight in just one hit. I set myself up at the end with a stride, so on the turn I opened the door, I was able to steal the final magic staff and clear a path. Caspar and Bernadetta just had to kill a Cavalier and Mage, after which Sylvain could reach. The Lance of Ruin has a massive 22 might, which gets doubled using the Cavalry effective Nightmealer combat arts, giving Sylvain the attack needed for an Oko. The Flame Emperor shows up just to escape with a Death Knight, but Sedith can rest assured that Flayn is safe at last. Bernie, your Vengeance Oko at the end wasn't that impressive. Fire Emblem! Engage! We've driven off Hortensia, but Brodia Castle is still at risk of an attack from more Elusian forces, who are said to have 5 more emblem rings left. We rush over to the gates, where we thankfully see that the castle is peaceful for now, and are introduced to Brodia's crown prince, Diamant. Alcris delivers the news of the Elusian attack, and while it takes a second to get the attention of the king, Morian, he soon has us up in arms and gives his kingdom's emblem ring to Diamant for the upcoming fight. The emblem of binding, Roy. Just in time, too, as Elusia's crown princess Ivy quickly swoops in with her army, set to take our lives, our souls, and our rings. Much like Conquest's Chapter 10, we have a defense point to protect, a starting area with a ballista and breakable walls, and flyers that attempt to skip past our defenses. Unlike Conquest though, this is a defeat boss map, and Ivy moves, so I had to plan out a clear that would let me defeat her retainers and get the item drops before winning, but still in minimal turns. In preparation, I used last chapter's Master Seal to promote Citrine into Sage. She won't be staying in it for long, but she'll still get in some practice as a staff utility unit. Then for another blonde-related team change, Diamant's retainer's Horse runs in with Diamant's retainer Amber, joining us in the battle to protect Brodia just in time. Diamant seems perfectly suited for this defense map, with all-around competent physical stats that should let him be a strong frontliner. Roy's emblem accentuates this, with a big strength boost, Holdout letting him survive big hits at 1 HP, and Rise Above giving an all-around stat boost. Amber isn't quite so impressive at first, being a slow Lance Cavalier, but he's the unit I'm more interested in using. Mostly because I like his heroic attitude, but he's also got high personal strength and a personal skill that provides a conditional plus 20 hits, which gives him great applicability with some emblems and reclassing. For now though, the two will mostly have to sit out, because my other units can pull off an approach much more aggressive than sitting at choke points. I have Queen engage with Sigurd to start clearing out enemies in the east turn 1, and Alfred engages with Celica to warp into the west. With an Obstruct, I'm able to keep the Flyers and a Lance Fighter away from him, so he can confidently survive a Lance Fighter, Axe Armor, and Mage on enemy phase. Illusia seems to be incorporating Corrupted into their army, so with Seraphim he either one-shot or one-rounded the first 3. Turn 2, I started drawing over Ivy's retainers, with Chloe instigating the thief Zelkov, and Alfred instigating the Swordmaster Kagetsu. Switching over to the Reprisai, Alfred was able to 2-shot Kagetsu and use its dodge boost to avoid facing crits, while Chloe got help from Queen to take on Zelkov. Alchrist had an important job of shooting down flyer reinforcements with the Ballista, and everyone else focused on fighting a few stray enemies, maximizing the number of my units that got damaged, so Anna had more heal targets. She started this map just below level 9, and my goal was to get her level 10 here. After this chapter, Anisa's item shop restocks, which not only adds our 3rd Master Seal, but also 2nd Seals. Since promoted units don't lose any XP gain, insta-promoting and directly reclassing into any other promoted class is a no-brainer, and a really big power spike while we're still fighting unpromoted enemies, as we should see with Anna. After this chapter, we also finally get infinite tonics from the shop, and a huge gold fund from Brodia. This makes Engage's early chapters feel pretty distinct to me, as you have to make units work in their base class. This helps encourage specific interactions, like having Etier and Alchrist one-shot flyers, and needing the speedy but frail Chloe to be the one to fly over walls. There's also more unique emblem synergies, like how Saline and Clan use Celica to one-round Axe Fighters and Knights, while someone like Alfred or Louis use Celica to warp into and tank larger enemy formations. Don't get me wrong, I like when options open up, and we could theoretically have Alfred be a Sage that one-rounds, but I also think it's good to have this time to not be overwhelmed by complex build possibilities. And from a difficulty perspective, I would compare Engage Maddening to Revelation Lunatic, with a focus on high enemy quality, but absurdly high stats are saved for late game, and you quickly get strong tools. It's just the first few chapters where you don't have preps and base features that are a little irritating to me, but like, they're fine, I guess. Otherwise, my gameplay experience up to now has been defined by giving my favorite units emblems and training them up for a promotion, which to me has felt just as thoughtful but more fun than just fighting really strong enemies like in Binding Blade. Overall, I like viewing next chapter as a big moment for opening up options, but I have to recognize that Engage has another more notable shift in a few chapters. No spoilers, but the narrative is going to take a dramatic turn, our emblems are going to get a big update, and new recruits are going to be pre-promotes with unusually high personal stats. In fact, these story and gameplay changes are so notable that I'd say Engage gets the clearest end to an early game, excluding the games with an external structure like Gaiden's Axe. Which is pretty cool, especially considering Engage could have just settled on providing seals after a castle map, as usual. I delayed provoking Ivy longer than necessary, but it only took until turn 3 to defeat her retainers, so I was ready to defeat her turn 4. She's bulkier than you'd expect, with her Mystery Dark Emblem giving defensive boosts and the Adaptable skill, letting her always counterattack at advantage. I was able to get enough damage to defeat her with just Chloe and Queen, so Alfred could use his action to defeat a mage for the Wind Tome, and Citrine and Diamant could get themselves hurt to set up for an Augment Men for Anna to reach level 10. With our side objectives complete, Chloe could then one-round Ivy with Lodestar Rush. We won't get our entire team their final setup next chapter, but we're making great strides, and I can't wait to show off the amazing things our new emblems and reclassing let us do. And that wraps up part 7 of the Sync Marathon. To recap, I have 25 parts planned for this series, which now puts us 28% done with the run, or just over the 1/4 mark. We're still waiting for a few big moments, but I think it's pretty fun that most every game in this part had an aspect I could frame as the end of our early game, whether it be a Master Seal, a conclusion to a storyline, or a climactic map. And even without a promotion, all our units of choosing have been trained well over base, making our teams feel more personal and suited for overcoming challenges. As another surface level similarity, the enemy composition during these chapters felt roughly consistent. Like, we always started with a couple maps of slow fighters and weak soldiers to get used to standard combat and tactics. Then we got introduced to attack ranges, effectivity, and magic, with archers, knights, and mages. Then if the game was feeling particularly interesting, it would throw high movement enemies at us, like cavaliers and wyverns, to threaten basic formations. And from a narrative standpoint, it felt like we were frequently concluding the first narrative arc at an important castle, or setting sail to new horizons via boat. Which I guess makes sense, but it's kind of funny how this describes almost every game. To me, the games that have the strongest early game from a narrative standpoint are Thracia, Radiant Dawn, and Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia. While Thracia does have an important moment in the castle, it's actually just set up for the real early game, with a unique imprisonment and escape arc that ties well with Thracia's new mechanics. Radiant Dawn has a clear external structure using parts, and the usage of split perspectives with different takes on the war keeps it interesting rather than feeling forced. Likewise, Gaiden has the act structure with multiple unique armies, and I really like how the overworld visualizes your journey towards an end goal. From a gameplay perspective, it was a bit harder to narrow down specific moments of change, as technically the player is always getting new tools and options to choose from throughout every playthrough. However, I do like my observations that the first promotion and access to prep screen features really solidify the feeling that you have control over your team and how maps play out. Which is especially true as between chapter bases got bigger and gave more impactful options like forging and reclassing. So everything before this point can be defined as getting used to the gameplay in a controlled environment and choosing who you want to train. This generally works out, but I do take some issue with how important early promoting can be to concluding the early game experience. In my opinion, promotion timing is an interesting decision, with most games since Thracia making you choose if you'd rather give a unit immediate promotional gains in exchange for a drop in XP gain. I like this, but it means the players who made the valid decision of waiting are missing out on a change in game feel early on. As such, just giving a Master Seal usually isn't enough for me, and I like it when the player is given various other strong tools to work with at the quarter mark, whether it be a strong weapon, like finally getting a Horseslayer in Binding Blade, or getting a strong unit, like Camilla in Conquest. Another simpler solution is just to make promotion timing irrelevant entirely. Gaiden, Genealogy, and Engage come to mind, as games where there's basically no reason to not promote ASAP, which makes the first level goal or promotion item a more concrete turning point. Turning points aside though, I have to recognize that a big factor in how much I enjoyed each early game experience was difficulty mode. Starting in Binding Blade, hard mode quite literally impacts its early chapters more, with double the stat bonuses. Then as games started making base features more prominent, early chapters just felt particularly rough because you don't have the tools to influence your units to match up well against super strong enemies. I know this can be fun for some players, but I don't like how New Mystery, Awakening, and Three Houses give you such an overwhelming start. Revelation, Shadows of Valentia, and Engage feel much more approachable on the highest difficulty modes, because, your units aren't getting one-rounded by everything, and training up a team feels both thoughtful and reasonable. Lastly, I'll recognize that some games don't have a clear turning point until halfway through, like Genealogy, and some don't have any distinct shift in narrative or gameplay, relying on a constant influx of new features or plot points. This is fine, and I actually like how Fates and Three Houses play out because of the new base features and skills. And with mini story quests always being handed out and completed, my attention is held well enough. It's just we miss out on the big story or gameplay moments where everything comes together, which is a bit of a shame. Overall, I've been having a fun time with all the games, but if I had to pinpoint which I've liked the least, well, hands down, I've had the most frustrating moments with Mystery of the Emblem, and Binding Blade in a close second. And even though I've had a lot of nice things to say about Thracia in concept, I have to say it's been a little rough to play in practice. I have been enjoying the DS games and Awakening, but if I were on Lunatic, those would probably also be low on my list. The early games I liked the most were Engage, Radiant Dawn, and Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia. We haven't even gotten to Engage's big moments, but I like the process of training up units for promotion in time for when the seals unlock, with various fun emblem combinations to get there, and I respect maddening mode for not actually being maddening. Radiant Dawn and Gaiden, then, have the act structure that I find to be satisfying, with stories that I feel make good use of the structure and unique gameplay experiences for the split armies. The Dawn Brigade struggling to get by is, of course, an iconic experience, and Gaiden's first string of chapters feel very approachable and enjoyable to me. What can I say? I like Celica's mini-mage army, and training up Alm's villagers through their promotion of choice is quite satisfying. Shadows of Valentia is a game I can always boot up, knowing I'll have a fun time binging the first acts. Our real journeys are just starting though, and I'm looking forward to showing what my trained teams can do as we get to bigger chapters. In Binding Blade, we'll traverse the very lengthy halls of Ostia Castle to rescue Lilina. In Three Houses, we'll do our first paralogs before going up against the Blue Lions and Golden Deer in the mock battle. In Engage, we'll have some spectacular team-defining reclasses while utilizing our new emblems as we make our last stand against illusion forces. And in Shadow Dragon, well, actually, we've passed the point that I've played before, so the maps will be completely blind, and I'm looking forward to seeing what's in store. If you have any thoughts on the various early games, whether it be one you think has a strong identity, or just one that you enjoy playing, feel free to let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to vote for next part's topic in the community section, and if you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.